I was recording north of Manaus in the middle of Brazil, and I was with my colleague from Harvard, Ruth Happel, and we decided to go out one night to see if we could get some recordings of the early morning, like just after midnight, soundscapes. And we were walking down the trail, and we smelled this marking scent of a jaguar that we knew was nearby, but we didn't want to startle it with our torches. But it kept following us down this trail several kilometers. Finally, at one point, we decided to go off in different directions and record to get the widest variety of natural soundscapes that we could. But I got to a place where I set up my equipment. I have a 10-meter cable, and so the cable was at one end, and I was sitting in this tripod chair, and all of a sudden this jaguar came up to the mic and literally began to vocalize like a pop singer.
Welcome to Sounding Places, Listening Places, a Radio ArtEZ podcast series in which we explore the relationship between sound and our environment. My name is Joep Christenhusz. In contemporary Western culture, we seem to have lost an intimate connection with the land. More often than not, we think of our surroundings as a passive backdrop in which humankind can take center stage, controlling the landscape, developing infrastructures, and extracting resources at will. This rather anthropocentric position has become unviable, however, as recent human-sponsored ecological crises like climate change, the dramatic loss of biodiversity, and large-scale destructions of habitats are pointing out. If we wish to develop a more sustainable future, we urgently need to reconnect to our environment and restore a more reciprocal relation with the Earth. In this mini-series, we inquire if sound and listening can help us to do so. A minute ago, you were listening to an excerpt from a podcast by The Guardian. You were hearing the voice of Bernie Krause, who is our first guest in his first episode. Since the 1970s, Krause has been a pioneer in the field of so-called soundscape ecology, a bioacoustic discipline that studies the natural sounds of the land and the sea. Bernie Krause has been making recordings of natural soundscapes for over 50 years now, resulting in a unique archive of more than 5,000 hours of wildlife recordings from all over the world. This extraordinary collection offers many glimpses in the many acoustic richnesses of the natural world, but it also testifies of the destructive influence of humankind.
50% of my archive is from habitats that no longer exist in their original form, certainly.
Bernie Krause's career in soundscape ecology seems to have been predestined. Ever since his early childhood years, he showed a strong predilection for the natural sound world.
Well, my childhood home in Detroit was located on what was then, before World War II, the outskirts of the city. And it was on land that had once been farmed. And by the time we moved there, it had gone wild again, and it was repopulated with many migrating birds and as well as butterflies and other insects, lots of frogs, and even some mammals. And as a young child, I was afflicted with a terrible case of attention deficit disorder. And by just throwing open my bedroom window and becoming immersed in the extraordinary resonance of that proto-orchestra really helped calm me down. And it made me feel less agitated and nervous.
Before following his calling as a soundscape ecologist, however, Krause pursued a career in electronic music.
In the mid-1960s, I was still looking for something to do and some way to express myself. And so I read somewhere about electronic music and the fact that there were these new instruments, these analog synthesizers that were beginning to appear. And I was curious about it, so I moved to California and started to audit classes at Mills College in Oakland, which is just across the bay from San Francisco, and studying with people like Pauline Oliveras and taking courses with Stockhausen. And while I was there, I met a fellow by the name of Paul Beaver. And Paul Beaver was a kind of wizard from Los Angeles who was very involved in doing sound effects on sound stages with these electronic instruments. So he had theremins, he had novochords, which were a very rare instrument developed by Hammond. He had all kinds of different instruments. He would scurry back and forth on a soundstage and create these sound effects for films like Creature from the Black Lagoon and other things like that, kind of these science fiction films. So anyway, I met Paul, and Paul and I decided to form a team called Beaver and Krause.
Together, Beaver and Krause would introduce the analog Moog synthesizer to the likes of George Harrison, the Monkees, the Byrds, and the Doors. The duo also collaborated on some 130 feature movie soundtracks, among which well-known blockbusters like The Graduate and In Cold Blood. In his solo career, Krause went on to use the Moog to create effects for hundreds of film and TV scores, perhaps most memorably with the indelible judder of the helicopters in Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. Despite his success in rock and film music, Krause felt a growing need to reset his artistic bearings and explore new sonic terrain.
And at some point in the late 70s, I had enough of the film and music business and working in these enclosed spaces. And I just felt too claustrophobic. I wanted to work outside with animals. And so I quit music. I went back to school and completed my doctorate with an internship in bioacoustics. And I've never looked back.
After getting a degree in bioacoustics, Krause quickly became an important pioneer in the emerging field of soundscape ecology. Simply put, the new discipline focused on the totality of sounds and their mutual relationships in the natural land and seascape. An important influence on Krause was the Canadian composer, educator and acoustic ecologist Raymond Murray Schafer, who had introduced the concept of the soundscape in the 1960s. In Schafer's definition, the soundscape involves any sounds that can be heard in a given acoustic environment. In his groundbreaking book, The Tuning of the World, he developed various strategies to study the soundscape, coining new concepts like keynote sounds, signals, and sound marks, and thus creating a whole new acoustic vocabulary.
Well, one only has to read Schafer very carefully, especially his first book in 1977, Tuning of the World, to realize his impact on the subject of sound. And it's been major. And quite frankly, there's almost nothing that's been observed or written on the subject that Schafer in that book didn't cover or suggest. And that was 4 decades ago. So he's quite a remarkable thinker, and by the way, he's one of my favorite composers of the 20th century. I've taken a few ideas of his that he touched upon, and I've expanded on them. Schafer came up with the concept of the soundscape, and by the soundscape, he meant all of the sound that reaches our ears from whatever source. The problem is that he didn't identify the sources very clearly. So I began to deconstruct the idea of the soundscape just to see what would happen if I did. And the first thing that we discovered was that there are non-biological sources of sound that have their place in the soundscape field. For instance, the effects of wind and weather and water that are non-biological but still have an impact on what we hear, and they're natural sounds. And they were the first sounds heard on Earth, by the way, the geophony. But then there are the biological sounds created by organisms that generate some kind of acoustic signal, and they can generate it any number of ways. Some vocalize, others do stridulation where they rub wings together or their legs on their abdomen like ants sing. And others just do it like fish, for instance, like certain kinds of fish gnaw on coral and they create an acoustic signal that way. So there are all kinds of ways that these signals are created, but that's the biophony. All of the biological organisms that create sound would fall into that category.
Apart from breaking down the soundscape into categories like the geophony and biophony, one of Krause's many important contributions to soundscape ecology has been a so-called acoustic niche hypothesis.
The niche hypothesis shows how sound is organized in healthy habitats. If there's a lot of critter density, each voice has to find its own channel or bandwidth in order for it to be heard. If these animals are expending this energy as part of their behavior, they better have some return on that investment in their energy expense. And so they have to find these channels where there's very little acoustic energy so that their voices can be transmitted, so that they can be heard and received by other members of the same group or also by others. So the insects find the niches that are clear channels for them. The birds find other niches. The mammals find all other niches. Bats way in the high end and like elephants down in the very low end. Just like instruments in an orchestra.
Owing to this complex web of acoustic connections, every landscape has a unique sonic signature, Krause found. And what's more, analyzing soundscape recordings by means of the acoustic niche hypothesis can provide detailed information about the ecosystem in question. Biodiversity, population density, and the potential presence of invasive species can all be detected in the texture of a given acoustic habitat. This may sound a little abstract, so let's listen to a striking example. You are going to hear a field recording that Krause made in Lincoln Meadow, high up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. He made 2 sets of recordings, one before and one after a logging company started cutting down trees using a so-called selective logging strategy.
Selective logging was a paradigm that the logging companies established in the 1980s and tried to implement, trying to convince people that there would be no environmental impact from taking out a tree here and there rather than cutting a whole forest down. So I went out there to record in June of 1988, and late that summer, the logging company came through and did their selective logging. And a year later, in 1989, I came back at the same time in June and recorded again to compare the two examples. And sure enough, while to our eye, not a tree or a stick looked out of place, and you couldn't see any difference, to our ear, everything had changed. The density of the bird life had dropped off, meaning the total numbers of birds. The diversity had dropped off. The total numbers of species had dropped off. And it was as if almost nothing was there. And I have this example that I show in 15 or 20 seconds that shows before and after.
Now let's listen first to the situation before. And now the situation after. The Lincoln Meadow field recordings clearly show us how, by listening closely to the natural soundscape, we may learn things about our environment that otherwise would have remained invisible and unknowable. In this context, the American sonic theorist Brandon LaBelle refers to sound as a dirty and dirtying force. In his book Background Noise, Perspectives on Sound Art, he writes how sound can bring us into contact with, quote-unquote, that which may be found in the gaps of appearance. Sound is the continual emergence of alterity, he writes. It gives us an immediate sense of the other. As such, listening can be a powerful way of reattuning ourselves to the natural environment and the non-human species that live in it. According to Bernie Krause, such a reattunement is badly needed.
Because we have no more connection, we think we have no more connection to the natural world. We're separate from it. So there's nature and there's us. And we never bring the two together, certainly not in Western culture.
In this respect, we can learn a lot from indigenous cultures.
There are still some groups that live more closely connected to the natural world. For instance, at one point I worked with a group in the Amazon basin called the Jivaro. And at some point, after several weeks, I was allowed to go on a hunt with the men at night. And what was remarkable to me is they would walk through the forest without any torches or light, and they couldn't see above the canopy because it was too thick. They couldn't see the stars and navigate by celestial objects. But what they were doing was they were going through these grids of biophony, and they had this oral map, this kind of sonic map in their heads, where they were in the forest by just the soundscape and the way that the sound was articulated. And that guided them through the forest.
During the course of his career, Krause worked with several other indigenous cultures, like the Baagwa Pygmies in the Central African Republic and the Kaluli in Papua New Guinea.
These groups still live connected to the forest, and they use the sounds of the natural world as a karaoke orchestra with which they perform. They're imitating the melodies that birds create. They're imitating the rhythms that they see beat out on the buttresses of fig trees by the great apes, by the chimpanzees and bonobos, orangutans, and gorillas. None of these groups have a word for music. None of these groups have a word for artist. None of these words have a group for composer. They're all part of that whole fabric of sound. When they hear certain sounds at certain times of day or night, they break into song because they're communicating, they're signaling back to the origins of those sounds, their feelings and their emotion and their response to it, because it's a spiritual effect too for them. But it's not to us. We have no connection to that anymore. As a matter of fact, we built the churches in the 11th, 12th, 13th century with these huge, thick walls. Part of the reason, that the subtext of that, was to shut out the sounds of the natural world and just to have the reverberation of our own voices recycled over and over again, our own music, because that was considered to be the greatest and most divine of all.
In his best-selling book, The Great Animal Orchestra, Krause tells the captivating story of the North American Wayam tribe, a story that, despite its sadness, testifies of the deep spiritual meaning the natural soundscape had for this people.
While I was working on the Columbia River, a local resident told me of a story of a nearby Native American group whose communal life had completely revolved around the sound of a waterfall. And because this waterfall was the basis of their creation story. Elders in the Wayam tribe tell of a period spanning thousands of years when they fished all year long around Celilo Falls, which is where this waterfall was, just west of the Columbia River's midway point. Well, the waterfall animated their lives as a group and sustained them through every generation. So central were the falls to the tribe that the Celilo was considered a sacred voice through which divine messages were conveyed. And Wayam, the name of the tribe, by the way, means the echo of falling water. Well, on the morning of March 10th, 1957, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, hoping to improve navigation in the river, ordered the massive steel gates of the newly built Dalles Dam shut tight, thus strangling the natural downstream flow of the river. 6 hours later, the sacred waterfall and fishing site of the YM, 8 miles upstream, was completely submerged. And although they had been forewarned, the YM elders stood on the river bank, astonished, watching as a way of life that had flourished for centuries disappeared in less than a day. There wasn't a dry eye on the banks of the Salilo, the small namesake village on the river's edge. And yet the elders were not weeping for the loss of the salmon. They wept because the river no longer lent its wise voice to the community. The soundscapes of the submerged Salilo Falls were dead silent.
The question remains, however, how the practice of soundscape recording relates to the deeply spiritual involvement that these indigenous people have with their natural surroundings. In a very fundamental way, the act of recording sound involves a displacement, a removing of sound from its context. What exactly remains of the sacredness of its original environment in this process, and what happens with the idea of place altogether? And doesn't the act of getting sounds on tape somehow mirror the extractive paradigm that got us into this urgent ecological crisis in the first place?
Depends on how it's used. It depends on how it's respected. I would never suggest that what I've recorded is a fair representation of a biophonic performance that just took place, because the mics just don't reproduce that. It's a snapshot, and it's a decontextualized snapshot. So those paradoxes and contradictions exist all over the place. Where I am guilty. At 82 years old, I'm in my 9th decade now. So for me, I've had to, come to terms with some choices, really hard choices, based on how much energy I have now and what I'm able to do with this work now. So I have this large archive. What do you do with it? Well, part of me as a scientist is to publish papers on this work. But if I take this material and put on my composer hat again, reach back into my past and do that, and transform this work, which John Cage suggested that I do, into works of art. In other words, put it into a different place, in a different setting, with the understanding that that's the goal to do that. It makes a big difference, and it reaches a lot more people, and it has a bigger impact because the goal is emotional rather than rational.
Turning a soundscape archive into art is exactly what Bernie Krause has been doing recently. After publishing his book The Great Animal Orchestra in 2012, he created the eponymous exposition for the French Fondation Cartier, a contemporary art museum in Paris. The exhibition brought together the work of artists from all over the world and invites the public to enjoy an aesthetic meditation, both oral and visual, on the animal kingdom, which is increasingly under threat in today's modern world.
The Great Animal Orchestra piece for the Fondation Cartier has been seen now by over 1 million people. People sit there for an hour and a half listening to soundscapes. That's extraordinary to me. I never imagined that could happen.
recent years, the artistic potential of Bernie Krause's unique field recording archive has been discovered by many more composers and sound artists. A fine example is the work of our next guest, the Dutch composer and producer Evelien van den Broek. In 2019, Van den Broek created Biophonica, a 40-minute performance about the dramatic deterioration of global biodiversity, in which she combined music for synthesizers, live electronics and solo trumpet with sounds of extinct and endangered animals. For the wildlife recordings, she contacted various scientists and field recordists, including Bernie Krause.
I read about his work, and I wrote him an email to ask him if it would be possible to maybe use some of his recordings for my music project. And we had a really nice email exchange in which he told me a bit about his work and also his personal situation, the way in which climate change has impacted his life. Because his house and studio and a lot of his recordings were destroyed during the wildfires in California. What's so special about his work is that you can hear the changes in nature through sound. He's actually been making field recordings in nature for about 50 years already, and he's regularly revisited the same spots. So, for instance, for the first part in the piece, which is called Rainforest, I used recordings of a Costa Rican rainforest that he made before and after clear cut. And you can actually hear how much more silent it has become. There's so much less density and diversity in the sounds you hear. So you can actually hear the consequences of our actions.
An important theme in Biophonica is the loss of biodiversity. I wondered, why did you want to make a piece about this topic? Do you feel the need to engage in such broader social issues?
It is something I've been worrying about for a long time, the way we humans are impacting nature and natural life. And I thought it would be good to see what I could do with this subject from the perspective of a composer or sound artist. I think it's important for people to also hear about this subject from a different perspective. Sound art and music can be meaningful here. It can make people more aware of what is happening. We're so disconnected from nature in our modern daily lives as city people or agricultural people. It's so far removed from our daily lives. I thought that by using actual sound recordings and music, when you listen to these sounds, you really feel like you're in the middle of, for instance, the rainforest. You are reconnected with the natural world through the senses, in a way.
It's interesting that you're mentioning that art and music in particular can foster a different perspective on these ecological matters. I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the way in which the musical perspective differs from, for instance, a scientific or philosophical perspective. Is it about a more embodied and sensorial experience, a more lived experience maybe?
Yes, definitely. It's a completely different experience than just reading about it. It has a different impact when you use your senses, in this case, your ears. For instance, to me it was quite emotional when I was listening to the recordings of the rhino. which is used in part 3. These are actual recordings of the last male northern white rhinoceros, so the last male of the entire species. You can hear it sniffing and breathing and chewing. It really felt like it was there in the room with me. So hearing these sounds of nature instantly make you feel more connected. You realize we are part of nature, or at least we should be. We cannot live without it. And also, with music, you can provide an extra layer of emotion through which you can feel the loss or sadness or anger.
When I'm listening to biophonica, there sometimes seems to be this symbolic layer to the interaction between electronic sounds and the animal sounds that you're using. A kind of man versus nature.
Well, yes, in several parts this is the case, but it's not totally this black and white. In part 1, Rainforest, I did make electronic sounds that resemble trees falling down. Or in part 2, Bees, I imagined bees falling out of the sky, disoriented and sick, which you can hear at the end. In the rhino part, the electronic sound world definitely stands for the human destruction. But electronics are also used to imitate animal sounds, or they focus more on the emotional side. In many parts, I really leave a lot of room for just the sounds of nature for the field recordings.
As another example, Van den Broek mentions the fourth part of biophonica, the blue whale. In it, she uses sounds of this massive sea giant that with a length of about 30 meters is one of the largest animals to have ever existed.
It's a really overwhelming sound, and it immediately sparks your imagination. You can just imagine being in this huge underwater space with this huge animal. The piece starts with around 2 minutes of just these sounds of the ocean and the whale, and then the music enters and merges with the animal sounds.
One last question, Evelien. The fact that you used recordings of a blue whale in biophonica, was this choice in any way inspired by Songs of the Humpback Whale, the 1970 album by Roger Payne?
It's funny you mention this. I actually found out about that later, so it wasn't related or inspired by that. But I just read an article about this album. It came out exactly 50 years ago. It has actually contributed to whaling being prohibited. So a lot of people started protesting against whaling after the album was released. I guess you could say that this is one of the examples in which the acoustic experience or sound and sound art did have an impact on how we humans see the natural world and made us want to protect it better.
Our third guest in this episode is Bernie Truax, a prominent Canadian acoustic ecologist, author of the influential book Acoustic Communication, and a prolific author and soundscape composer. Furthermore, Truax is a professor emeritus at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, where he taught both electroacoustic music and acoustic communication. Bernie Krause already told us how his career in bioacoustics has been greatly influenced by the Canadian acoustic ecologist R. Murray Schafer. As a matter of fact, this is also true for Truax, who closely collaborated with Schafer since the 1970s.
So in terms of Schafer himself, he was even then a very well-known Canadian composer, young, and had on Canadian standards, had a kind of radical kind of cachet about him. You know, he was quite fearless, shall we say. So he made quite a mark. But he also was making quite a mark in music education. He was emphasizing creativity, sound making, and of course, listening. And he countered that, or put it into counterpoint, with the sonic environment of the 1960s, which he claimed, and still does, was one of the noisiest decades ever. And he followed that up. I mean, it wasn't difficult, rather, to document that with jet engines, particularly the jets that had appeared rather than the propeller aircraft, the boom boxes, the motorcycles, the seaplanes, and particularly in Vancouver. There was no end of noise sources. But like all noise and anti-noise protests and movements over the last century, it rather led to pessimism as to, what can you do about it? It's just all negative. And Schafer decided to switch it around to a more positive orientation, a listener-based one. In other words, a grassroots or from an individual point of view, re-enabling listening.
The most important project that Murray Schafer set up in the late 1960s and early 1970s was the World Soundscape Project, a research group at Simon Fraser University dedicated to the recording, study, and archiving of soundscapes worldwide. Its ultimate goal was to find solutions for an ecologically balanced soundscape in which the relationship between the human community and its sonic environment can be in harmony.
And I was extremely fortunate back in 1973, in fact, at the end of my study and research period at the Institute of Sonology in Utrecht, involving electronic and computer music, to be invited by Schafer to join this then very new group called the World Soundscape Project. I joined when they were about to publish and finish up the Vancouver Soundscape with 2 LPs and a booklet, a very well-researched and beautiful booklet that documented the history of sound in the city area, going back to pre-recording things of what was in the written documentation of what was called ear witness accounts. The documentation aspect was very important. Of course, the equally important was the imperative to get people to listen to recordings and to listen to their environment.
Let's listen to a track from the Vancouver Soundscape called Vancouver Sound Marks. In it, we'll hear several characteristic Vancouver sounds. The World Soundscape project essentially was the cradle of acoustic ecology, a discipline that focuses on the systematic study of the world's soundscapes. Groundbreaking was the World Soundscape project's relational view on acoustics, in which the research group clearly distinguished itself from earlier 20th century interest in environmental sound. For example, composers like John Cage or the French musique concrète composer Pierre Schaeffer mainly focused on the intrinsic qualities of environmental sounds, on sound as an autonomous aesthetic object, that is. For the researchers of the World Soundscape project, however, sounds are always embedded in the context, materially, geographically, socially, culturally, and ecologically.
Again, this is, as I've emphasized, the rather environmentally conscious 1970s. And systems theory and ecosystems and ecology were concepts that were starting to emerge as an interdisciplinary approach to understanding a system of relationships in the environment. And at the same time, well, a little bit later, actually, historically, but within the next decade, Bernie Krause, who's now very familiar to a lot of people for his work in bioacoustics, was recording entire soundscapes, biological soundscapes, as an acoustic habitat. And that is where the two approaches started to rub shoulders and then increasingly become more integrated. Our aha moment in that process was the summer solstice recording, so-called because it was made in a rural environment in the Fraser Valley on the midsummer, on the summer solstice, for 24 hours. And that recording feat that now has been fairly well documented became part of our Soundscapes of Canada series when we reduced the recordings to a 1 hour, 2 minutes per original hour, because you can't really sit in one place and listen for 24 hours, but you could get an impression of that through the foreshortening that I described and the balance of it and the constant evolution of it.
4 minutes to the hour of 3 a.m.
.4 a.m.
It's 5 o'clock in the morning. It's 7 o'clock in the morning.
It's 8 o'clock on a sunny morning.
Truax clearly remembers how after the editing process, the summer solstice recording revealed something astonishing.
It was very much an aha moment that the acoustic environment, the bioacoustic habitat, was very balanced and functional, that different species have their sound making in distinct frequency bands, so that they have an acoustic channel of communication that is divided up into different frequencies. A simple analogy would be radio bands. So at the very most basic level of sound, then there are communication systems that are based on the physical acoustic properties, and they allow species to coexist, to function together, and in a very complex way. We can and should extrapolate that to our own bioacoustic habitat, and we could call it a socioacoustic habitat because it's usually a built environment. Is it sustainable? The bioacoustic habitat and the socioacoustic habitat also need to be functional, because that is partly how we relate to each other. And we should recognize that the natural environment, the bioacoustic environment, often is part of society and not something separate. There is a long Western tradition of separating humans from nature, and thinking of the domination of nature, as one of my colleagues wrote a book with that title many years ago, from a philosophical point of view, from the Enlightenment on, the idea that our mandate is to dominate and control and manage nature, and then look what we've done to it. All right, in that sense, I think we ignore it at our peril. So first of all, there's an inclusivity that is implied as to not think of them as two separate things, but as to be intertwined. And they are intertwined in every situation.
As a prolific composer, Truax believes that the interconnection between nature and culture, as well as between the natural and cultural sound world, can be successfully addressed through what he calls soundscape composition. In short, soundscape composition can be defined as a form of electroacoustic music that works with environmental sounds, the purpose being to invoke the listener's associations, memories, and imaginations that are related to these surroundings. In contrast to other forms of electronic music, in which field recordings are often heavily processed and edited to be used as just another instrument, a key characteristic of soundscape composition is the recognizability of the original soundscape. A sense of place, a feeling of actually being there on the spot is being communicated.
It starts with simply preserving recognizability. And why I have to emphasize that is that within the electroacoustic music tradition, we often treat our recorded sources as raw material or a sound object, and then process them and to the point where they are no longer recognizable. That's actually very easy to do in many cases. And that's because it basically doesn't matter. In fact, the source may be trivial. It might be crumpling a piece of paper, right? The piece is not about paper. It's about the sound, and it's about textures, and it's about taking those textured sounds, in the case of the crumpled paper, for instance, and turning them into something of oral interest just on its own. But that means that you have minimized the environmental references. And if I can call myself from the soundscape composition community, use the same techniques, but we have largely a different approach that is going to maximize the environmental references in some way.
To illustrate his point, Truax referred to a recent soundscape composition of his, Rainforest Raven, a piece which came out of recordings that were made on hikes in the rainforests on the Gulf Islands, near Vancouver.
So often you start, as Rainforest Raven does, with an unprocessed context. That's one simple way to do it. You establish a natural environment that has very recognizable sounds. In this case, you hear these natural drops of water, except they're actually much denser than probably anything you could possibly experience. So it gets your attention, but it also places you somewhere, right? And you might also sense that it's a very wide open space. Have you ever been to the west coast of North America?
No.
Well, it has an atmosphere, those rainforest recordings. As a composer, then I wanted to explore the symbolic possibilities of it. So, for instance, the raven cry, that is one of the most wonderful sound marks or sound signals, you might say, in the rainforest, is when they fly over. They guide you, as it were, through the acoustic space with their own trajectories. So I started processing those as a kind of a guide. As the water sounds that were dripping, they became increasingly processed, as did the raven. And at first there was a very joyous kind of processing, very musical. But then things start getting darker. For me, when it goes to more processing and abstracting from it, to me there's also a moving inward to the inner domain of memory, association, metaphor, symbolism, even myth, perhaps.
To conclude this first episode, let's return for a moment to one of the central questions of this podcast series. The question if sound and listening could help us to restore a more reciprocal relationship with the Earth. In the end, it might be by this veering between the sonic evocation of real places and a sonic exploration of one's inner world that a space for ecological rapprochement is created. If anywhere, it is in this meeting of outer and inner world that we may deepen our awareness of our surroundings.
Indeed, and to recognize that it's quite clear in a sound walk. The sound walk tends to be the archetypal form that from which soundscape composition derives in many ways. And when you're on a soundscape, yes, you are trying to pay attention to just sounds, but it's not saying that you shouldn't explore what they mean to you, what they evoke. What does that connote to you? Right, and so it could even become political or economic or cultural. There's all kinds of things that where sound leads. I always come back to where is sound leading. I'm increasingly loving that phrase. Where does sound lead? Because as composers, we tend to love our sounds as our creative materials. But what's really fascinating is where sound leads you to, because it imprints almost all aspects of life. It has all these implications of where does sound lead, and one of them is to reevaluate our relationship to each other, to the environment, and to even the well-being and sustainability of the world.
Many thanks for listening to Sounding Places, Listening Places, a Radio ArtEZ podcast series in which we explore the relationship between sound and our environment. In this first episode, we have been focusing on the natural soundscape. In the next, the British sound artist Peter Cusack will guide us in taking a closer listen at the urban sound world. With the young Dutch sound artist Elisa at Hart, we'll zoom in on the soundscape of our homes. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our mini episodes on deep listening, in which Sharon Stewart explores the life work of composer, musician, writer and humanitarian Pauline Oliveros. In the audio examples from Evelien van den Broek's Biophonica, the following field recordings were used. On track 1, Rainforest, we heard recordings by Bernie Krause. The field recordings on track 3, The Last Northern White Rhinoceros, were provided by Dr. Ivana Chinkova of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. The field recordings on track 4, The Blue Whale, were downloaded from freesound.org. Sounding Places, Listening Places was commissioned by ArtEZ Studium Generale. Interviews, texts and voiceovers by Sharon Stewart and myself, Joep Christenhusz. Editing and sound production by Dennis Gaans of Onderkast. I hope to see you again in our next episode.